G'day Internet, Chris here from Mac's Workshop. In this video I'm going to show you how I made this sweet as table for my drill press. I did a bit of research before building this thing and I found that a lot of other examples either were far too complex and had too many features that I wouldn't use, or they were too simplistic and were missing some of the essentials. So after doing that research, I've come up with what I think is the perfect table for a small shop. It's simple and easy to build and has all the features you'll need. With that said, let's dive into the video. Alright, before we get going, I thought I'd give you a quick rundown on the materials we're going to need to build this. So we're going to start off with some 3/4 inch or 19mm ply. We're going to need 2 layers of that for our drill press table. We're going to need 3 pieces of T-track. We're going to need 1 to go on the fence to put our stop blocks, and we're going to need 2 to actually run the fence along. We're going to need a couple of these things, and they will be to secure the fence to the table. We're going to need some threaded inserts. I've got some M6 here, but you could probably use some M8 and some associated bolts. We're going to use those to screw the table onto the drill press from the bottom. And finally, a piece of mica. It makes it a lot more durable on the top there and a lot more slippery. So that's the main components you need. There'll be a few screws and bolts along the way, but yeah, let's get into it. Alright, we're going to kick off the build by cutting the top of the table to exact dimensions of 500mm by 400mm, or roughly 20 inches by 16 inches. I'm using 19mm or 3/4 inch birch ply just because it's what I had on hand, but you can use anything really, including MDF. I cut the bottom piece of the table slightly larger as I'm going to flush trim it later with a router to ensure a perfect fit. I want to make a circular insert for the centre of the table, and this was the perfect excuse to use my new laser cutter to cut out a perfect router template. There are plenty of other ways to make a router template, and yours doesn't even need to be circular. Check out my router table build where I cut out a rectangle by just using scrap wood as a template. One common issue I've seen with homemade drill press tables is having the table raising handle clash with the actual table. So here I'm marking out the back right hand side to cut out later on to make room for the handle. With the back cutout marked, I can then mark where I want the centre cutout to be, and this will vary depending on your drill press. I didn't think of it at the time, but it may be a good idea to have it off centre so you can rotate the cutout when it starts to get a little too rough in one spot from overuse. With the cutout marked, I can then move on to cut out the cutout. Yeah, you know what I mean. I drill a few holes to allow me to start cutting with the jigsaw, and I cut close to the line but not exactly on the line, as we're going to clean it up later with the router. Looping back to the area to be removed to accommodate the handle, I start off by using the table saw to cut a straight line, finishing just before I get to the curve. Then it's back to the jigsaw to roughly cut the curve. Again, we'll clean this up later with a router. At this point we have the rough shape of the table, so it's a good idea to check it against the drill press to make sure it's all good. Now we can clean out the centre cutout. I'm using double-sided tape for the first time here, and I've got to say I was a little nervous and probably ended up using a bit too much tape, as it held really well and it was a little difficult to remove in the end. With the template in place, I use a trim router with a 12mm or 1/2 inch flush trim bit to follow the template. I then use the same template to clean up the curve at the back. With the tabletop done, we can now move on to the table bottom.
And at this point, you might be wondering why I had two different circles in my template. The reason is that I need the table bottom to support the insert I'm going to put in, but I also want the sawdust to be able to escape out the bottom. To do this, I'm simply going to make a smaller hole in the bottom to act as a sort of lip for the insert to come later on. I can also use the top as a template for the bottom when marking out for the back right cutout. Then it's just a matter of repeating the same process to cut out and clean up the small hole in the bottom. I also roughly cut out the back, but we won't clean this up till later. Moving back to the top, we're almost ready to put on the Formica, but one thing I want to do before that is to add a small chamfer to the bottom of the top piece. This is to prevent sawdust from building up underneath the insert and unsettling it. Again, using my trim router, I chalk up a chamfer bit with a bottom bearing and run it around the circle. Lastly, I trim the front corners off the top and the bottom of the table, as it's in a place that I walk past regularly and I'd rather not get stabbed by the corners every time I walk past. Alright, it's time to laminate the Formica to the top of the table. In the past, you may have seen me trying to cut this stuff with a saw. Well, it turns out you can simply score it with a knife and snap it, which is way easier. So using the score and snap method, I cut a piece that is roughly 7mm or 1/4 of an inch larger than that of the table. I'm using a contact adhesive to do the lamination, and I find the easiest way to do this is with a roller, applying a single coat to both the tabletop and the Formica. Try not to get any globs of glue, and also try not to go over places that I've already coated. After leaving the glue to dry for around 10 minutes until it's touch dry, I can then attach the Formica to the table. This stuff sticks as soon as it makes contact with itself, hence the name. So it's really important to make sure you've got it all lined up well. I use a couple of sticks laid across the table to make sure there's no contact made until I'm ready for it. I can then remove the sticks one at a time and use a roller to press it all down nice and flat. And because this stuff bonds instantly, we can flip it over straight away and use a flush trim bit with a bottom bearing to trim the Formica to the table edge. And for the insert hole, I simply drill a pilot hole for the router bit and then I trim that out too. It's finally time to glue the top and the bottom together. I'm using screws as clamps here, as there's some awkward places to put the clamps. But I do try to clamp near each screw before driving it in, as this helps prevent the screw from creating a gap between the two pieces. Also, because I cut the bottom piece slightly oversized, I don't need to be exact with my placement, as we're going to trim off the excess soon. Remember how I said we were going to trim off the excess? Well, we're going to trim off the excess now. Again, just using a flush trim bit with a bottom bearing. I gotta say, this little router wins tool of the day for this project. It feels like I've used it in almost every scene so far, and we're not done yet. I want to add a small chamfer around the top of the table to help prevent the edges of the Formica from chipping out. Now to make an insert for the table, and to do this I'm just going to use the circle that was cut out of the template earlier. I start off by tracing the shape onto some more of the same plywood, and then I take it over to the bandsaw to roughly cut it out. Then it's back to the double-sided tape trick, and I stick the circle onto my rough cut insert. Because this piece is so small, I can't really use the trim router, so it's off to the router table to flush trim the insert to my template. This feels pretty sketchy, so I take my time here, being super conscious of how close my fingers are to that spinning wheel of death. After a quick sand to clean up the edges, it's time for a test fit, and I'm pretty darn happy with the result. However, there is one issue. Because the top has Formica on it, it's slightly thicker than the insert, meaning that there's this annoying lip here. Now I could laminate the underside of the insert, but these are meant to be disposable and I don't want to laminate every single one. So instead I cut out a bunch of small pieces of Formica and glue them to the bottom lip of the table. This will raise the insert to be perfectly flush with the top of the table. I probably should have mentioned this earlier, but laminating the table with Formica is completely optional. You can totally make this table without it, but I seem to have a bit of a theme going in my workshop, so why stop now? Alright, it's time to build the fence, and we're going to go super simple here. All I want is a fence that I can adjust and fit stop blocks to. The fence is going to be made of 2 strips of plywood. Ultimately, I want the strips to be 70mm or 2 3/4 inches wide, but right now I'm going to cut them oversized so I can trim them up later on. A quick note, when deciding the height of your fence, make sure you don't make it too high so that it interferes with the feed handle of your drill press. This is a common mistake and super annoying if you discover it after you've built your fence. Next up, we trim the strips to the rough length of the table, which in my case is 500mm or roughly 20 inches, and then we glue them together. While I wait for the fence to dry, I move on to adding some T-track to the table for the fence to mount onto. So we need to cut a couple of dados in the table, and to do so I'm going to use a dado stack in my table saw. And to help try and prevent the Formica from chipping, I'm adding some blue tape to where the dados will be cut. I want the T-track to be 60mm or roughly 2 1/3 inches away from the edge of my table, as this will ensure that the knobs attaching the fence to the table don't interfere with the feed handle. This will be different for every drill press, so if you're making one of these for yourself, make sure you take your own measurements. So with that in mind, I set my fence to 60mm and the height of the blades to that of the T-track and cut the dados. So the blue tape trick didn't quite work as well as I would have liked. There's been a bit of chip out here and there, not enough that I'm going to go and remake the whole thing, but if I was to do it again in future, I would probably use a router, because I've used a router in the past and it's been fine with the Formica. With the dados cut, I can then cut the T-track down to size. I then take it over to the disc sander to give the edge a chamfer to match that of what I've already done to the table. Then, after putting the T-track in place, I pre-drill the holes for the screws using a self-centering drill bit to ensure I get the holes dead center. Then I can finally screw the T-track into place. With the glue on the fence dry, I can finally finish it off, starting by cutting it to final height of 70mm, or roughly 2 3/4 inches. Trimming it after the glue up ensures that you have a dead flat surface, as sometimes when you glue 2 pieces together, you can have one piece overhang the other slightly. Then we can trim it to final length on the drop saw. In order to allow for using stop blocks on the fence, I'm going to add some T-track to the face of the fence. I'm going to locate the T-track near the bottom of the fence just in case I need to adjust the height of the fence at a later date. And I cut the dado for the T-track with a dado blade just as before. To attach the fence to the table, I'm simply going to drill some holes right through the fence to fit some T-track bolts, making sure to have the holes align with the T-track on the table. My drill press didn't actually have enough depth to go right the way through the fence, so I finished the holes off with a cordless drill. And with the holes drilled, it's a good idea to do a test fit to make sure everything fits together. One thing to watch out for when making your fence is how tall the fence is on the side that has the levers. I've seen many people make the fence too high and the lever will go and knock into it. I thought that I was going to have to dip down on the side here, so I had an asymmetrical fence, but looking at it, I'm not sure I'm ever going to need that. So I think the 7mm high fence I've got is probably okay. If I ever come across an issue where it's not, I think I'll go and modify the fence at that time. I'll go and
notch in probably down here and just cut along the top there to make it a little bit smaller. But this seems pretty good, so I'm going to tidy up this fence and call it done.
So after a quick sanding that I'll spare you from watching, all I needed to do was to attach the T-track to the fence. The final task to be done is to bolt the table onto the existing drill press table. So to start off with, I put the new table in place and mark through some of the holes of the existing table onto the new table. I could then drill holes for the threaded inserts into the bottom of the table, and using blue tape on my drill bit as a guide to ensure I don't drill the holes too deeply. The threaded inserts I have are screwed in simply by using an Allen key or Allen wrench. Now we can take the table back over to the drill press and screw it into place using some bolts and large washers. And for a stop block, I simply cut a small piece of ply, drill a hole in it, and attach it to the fence with a T-track bolt.
Well, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. It was a nice, simple project and probably only took me about a day to build. Don't forget to smash that like and subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one. G'day Internet. In this video I'm going to show you how I made this sweet as thing. It's a thing with the stuff. It's pretty sweet, but I don't remember what it is.